church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and we're delighted that you're listening to our podcast. The world is at war. The world is at war. Listen, we can't turn on the news right now except to read about this world war between Israel and Iran. The exchange of missiles and bombs and all kinds of speculation about what this is going to lead to. And in the midst of all this, I'm hearing reporters make references to the Bible, and sometimes revealing their ignorance about the biblical teaching. I heard a CNN reporter earlier today mocking people of faith in the Senate and in the Congress, calling them rapture preppers, whatever that means, and sort of accusing them of taking a position regarding this war based on their faith. The only thing I'm going to say about that today is there's no question that the Bible teaches that those who curse Israel will be cursed. Clear. Hands down. No questions about what that biblical teaching says. And, on this podcast, I've talked frequently about the Bible as the most amazing, influential, unique, and transformational book that exists. And, many refer to the Bible as a living document that contains a wisdom that can never be exhausted. And it's no wonder then that the Bible is far and away the best-selling book of all time. It's been on the bestseller list for 2,000 years. That's 100,000 weeks on the bestseller list. And it's estimated that the Bible has sold more than 5 billion copies since it was first published and went on sale. And then each year, over 100 million copies of the Bible are sold. And right here in the United States, we've had some encouraging news, and that is last year, the sale of Bibles increased over 22%, sort of reflecting that something interesting is going on in the United States when it comes to Christian faith. And we can laugh about this. The Bible is also the most stolen and shoplifted book in the world. Since the Bible came into existence, there have been, just repeated attacks by agnostics and atheists and skeptics. And I'm surprised that some lines of the criticism never go away. And, what I want to talk about today is something that is called by some copycat theology. It's the idea that Christianity was copied from pagan myths. I keep running into this either on the internet or sometimes personally when someone in the street wants to talk to me about the falsehood of Christianity. This copycat interpretation began with a collection of theologians back in the 1890s. One of the major proponents of this school of thought published a book in 1910 entitled Hellenistic Mystery Religions. Instead of understanding Jesus as a Jewish Messiah, these scholars interpreted him, Jesus, as a pagan. And more recently, in contemporary times, James G. Frazier, He popularized Christianity as a copycat religion in a book entitled The Golden Bough, published in 1914. And then even more recently, others have followed in his footsteps in atheistic documentaries like Brian Fleming's The God Who Wasn't There, that came out in 2005, and Peter Joseph's Zeitgeist in 2007, and Bill Meyer's documentary Religious in 2008. All these documentaries reported that the early Christians borrowed the concept of the resurrection from pagan myths about dying and rising gods. They talk about pagan gods like Dionysus and Mithra and Baal, Adonis, Attis, Demeter, Persephone, and Aphrodite, Isis, Osiris, and others. Now, let me be very clear here about what exactly is being alleged. It's that the gospel is not true. That's what's being alleged. That it was an invention of the apostles and early Christians who pieced it together by taking elements from various pagan myths, the stories of gods and goddesses and heroes from pre-Christian and what we call polytheistic cultures, meaning many gods. From time to time, yes, I encounter skeptics who make these assertions. They'll say, hey, Pastor Dennis, all this stuff is just based in paganism. It's just surprising to me that this point of view about Christianity being a copycat religion still exists. I think it's like a lot of things on the internet. Once a point of view is available on the internet, it seems to take on a life of its own. Right now, it's easy to go on the internet and find assertions about pagan gods. That assertions that several of them were born on December 25, and that several of them also died and were resurrected, and the god Krishna was also the son of a carpenter and called the Son of God, and on and on and on. Now, can you see where this argument goes? Can you? Well, it's being asserted that the authors of the Gospels took the elements of Jesus' life straight from these earlier myths. And which, by the way, I have to say, all of these myths seem to be copied from each other, but that never seems to be mentioned. So they want these proponents want their listeners to conclude that Jesus' story was made up, that it's false. Now, one of the interesting things to me is that other well-known skeptics and atheists have criticized these documentaries, particularly the documentary Zeitgeist. And, one of the skeptics, Mitt Dillahunty, writes, the film is an unscholarly, sophomorically, horribly flawed oversimplification. It tries to portray Christianity as nothing more than the next incarnation of the astrologically themed religions that preceded it. Like all conspiracy theories, they combine a few facts, focus on correlations, and build an intriguing story that seems to fit the pieces together nicely, provided you don't dig down below the surface to find out where they might have gone wrong. And then an atheist scholar who I have criticized his points of view several times on this podcast is a man by the name of Professor Bart Ehrman from the University of North Carolina, who wrote Where do any of these ancient sources speak of a divine man that was crucified as an atonement for sin? He says, so far as I know, there are no parallels to the central Christian claim. What has been invented here is not the Christian Jesus, but the mythicist claims about Jesus. He says the majority of scholars agree there is no unambiguous evidence that any pagans prior to Christianity believe in dying and raising gods. He adds, none of the literature is written by scholars trained in the New Testament. Very interesting. Now, even these atheistic scholars agree that there are problems. There are problems with this argument that Christianity is a copycat religion. There might be some similarities between pagan myths and the Gospels, but that does not make the Gospel false in any way. Put simply, the mere existence of similarities between an earlier story and a later one does not automatically mean the later story is false. Let me give you an example. What if I told you that there was a huge ship over 800 feet long and carried thousands of passengers, and that this ship was equipped with only a minimum number of lifeboats? And it was said that this ship was unsinkable, but it sank after hitting an iceberg on its starboard bow, about 400 miles north of Newfoundland, at midnight one night in April, tragically killing many hundreds of people. The name of the ship is spelled Titan. Oh, I bet you thought I was talking about the Titanic. No, I'm actually describing the Titan. Yes, Titan, the Titan, a cruise liner described in a story by the name of Futility, written in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic actually sank. Now, do the parallels between these stories mean that the Titanic never really happened or existed? Of course not. This is an example of demonstrating that parallels do not equal, they do not equal falsehood. Another example how misleading parallels could be is found in the historical documents of President Lincoln and President Kennedy. Both Lincoln and Kennedy were elected to Congress in the year 46. Lincoln 1846 and Kennedy 1946. Both had eye muscles that would cause one eye to wander. Both had been skippers on boats. Both were the second sons in their families. Both had a child die while they were in the White House. And, both were related to U.S. senators. Both were advised not to go to the place where they died. And both were slain on a Friday before a major holiday. Both were shot from behind and in the head. And, Lincoln was shot while inside the Ford Theater at Box 7. And Kennedy was shot while inside a Ford automobile in Car 7 in the motorcade. Both were pronounced dead in places with the initials PH. Both their assassins escaped, and they were privates in the military. And we could go on and on and on about the parallels between President Lincoln and President Kennedy. Now, do these parallels invalidate the existence of President Kennedy? Of course not. Of course not. To argue this is, we'd have to show that in some way the assassination of Lincoln somehow influenced the story of the assassination of Kennedy. In the same way, Christian parallels certainly sometimes seems to exist with pagan mythology. But again, the skeptic would have to show how these pagan myths and stories uh, caused Christian beliefs. Now, now, we have to be careful when skeptics are attacking the Bible with stories about pagan gods. And when it comes to supposed similarities between pagan myths and the gospel, with a little bit of study, it becomes obvious that some skeptics are willing to distort and even lie when it comes to descriptions of pagan gods. You can go down the list. Horus, I mean, I could talk at length about this pagan god. He had no virgin birth, was never buried, never resurrected. Dionysus, he supposedly was a child of Zeus and Semele, and also he was not born of a virgin. He died when he was torn to pieces, boiled, and eaten. And Mithra, you know, he, he emerged fully grown, apparently, from a rock, not a virgin. He never died. He never was resurrected. That's what the myth says. And Krishna, who I referred to earlier, also, he wasn't born of a virgin. Uh, gosh, his body didn't resurrect from the dead. He really wasn't the son of a carpenter. And we can't find any reference to some star rising in the east at his birth. And then the pagan god Attis, he was born apparently from an almond implanted in his mother's womb. And nor was he crucified. He seems to have died from self-mutilation. All these are myths about these pagan gods that you can go on the internet and find a completely different description of their myth, alleging that that's where the story of Jesus came from. Most of the information we possess today about these pre-Christian pagan religious cults actually comes from post-Christian sources. And because of that, we really don't know what the actual adherents of these religious cults and sects believed in the pre-Christian era. It's possible and even probable that the spread of Christianity around the world influenced the myths instead of the other way around. This is ironic, isn't it? That the claim of the skeptics that it was Christianity that was influenced by the pagan myths, it's far more likely that these pagan myths were influenced by the story of Jesus Christ. Now, so far, I've been talking about how embarrassingly absurd the argument is that Christianity and the story of Jesus is a copycat religion. The skeptics are saying that the authors of the New Testament stole their ideas from these pagan myths. Well, we know who wrote the gospel accounts, and we can analyze what their motives were. The Bible is very clear where the gospel story comes from and who the first Christians were who spread it. 2 Peter 1:16 tells us, "For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were witnesses of his majesty." We were the actual witnesses. A very important fact is that Jesus and the first Christians were Jewish. Now, you know that. Surely you know it. They were Jewish, the first Christians, not pagans. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because the skeptics claim that these Jewish believers cobbled their beliefs together using pagan, non-Jewish mythology. And they apparently expected other Jewish people to believe it. Now, although we're referring to them as pagan deities, the Bible uses another name, idols. Idols. In Jesus' day, no devout Jewish person would be caught dead having anything to do with idols. And the reasons are fascinating. Primarily, it was because of their exile. 586 years before Christ, the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed their temple and deported the Jewish people. They spent 70 years in exile, an experience that would shape the Jewish identity for generations to come. By the time the Gospels were written, the Jews had been back in their homeland for 400 years. But they had not forgotten the reason that their ancestors had been brutally and violently expelled from their land. Namely, it was because they had turned away from God and toward pagan idols and myths. Because of this, they were returned to the land. They were committed, because of this, when they returned to their land, they were committed to never going down that road again. During the time of Jesus in the first century, sure, they had their share of sins, but worshiping pagan gods and believing pagan myths, bowing down to idols, and adopting the belief systems of the Gentile nations around them was not among them. No, it was not among them. It is totally unrealistic to think that the apostles got together and developed this new religion known as Christianity, based on pagan, idolatrous mythology. Now, this is exactly why the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy 4:3-4 warned the early Christians not to turn aside to myths. Pagan idolatry and mythology was so detestable to the apostles and early Christians that the idea that they invented the gospel based on such myths is just totally unthinkable. Another important fact is the gospel story of Jesus Christ has the fulfillment of hundreds of years of scripture, prophecy, and foreshadowing. This is what gives so much of the New Testament credibility. The writers of the New Testament believed that Jesus was the fulfillment of everything that had been prophesied to Israel in the Old Testament scriptures. And they were constantly pointing this out. It really should blow your mind to realize just how many details of the life of Jesus Christ mirror the Old Testament predictions. I wish we had time to go through all of the Old Testament prophecies about the life of Jesus Christ, but let me just mention a few. In Psalm 41:9, it said, "Even my friend in whom I trusted, one who I ate my bread, has raised his heel against me," and was fulfilled by Judas, one of the 12. And Jesus said to them, "One of you will betray me, one who is eating with me, the one who is dipping bread in the bowl with me." In Zechariah 11:12-13, it reads, "Then I said to them, if it seems right to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. So they weighed my wages, 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, this magnificent price I was valued by them." And then over in fulfilled in Matthew 26:15, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" Judas Iscariot. So they weighed out 30 pieces of silver. And those silver coins would be thrown into the temple, would go to the potter, which was foretold in Zechariah 11:13. And in Matthew 27:5-7, it tells us, "So he threw the silver into the temple and departed." I could just go on and on and on about all of the Old Testament prophecies that we see in the New Testament. His hands and feet were pierced. Foretold in Psalms 22:16, they pierced my hands and feet. And we know that in the New Testament when it tells us in Mark 15:24 that they crucified him. And that, before his crucifixion, that he would be scourged. And we see this in Isaiah 53:5. By his wounds we are healed. And after in Matthew 27:25, 6 in the New Testament, we're told about Jesus being flogged and handed over to be crucified, that his bones would not be broken. Again, prophesied, Psalm 34:20. He protects all his bones and none of them is broken. And then here again in John 19:33 and 36, we see that this was fulfilled, that none of his bones were broken. We could go on and on and on through this long list of Old Testament prophecies about the life of Jesus. Some of them are absolutely fascinating to me and add so much credibility to the gospel of Jesus Christ. The gospel is rooted in these ancient writings. And, as you can plainly see and understand, the events of Jesus' life, death, his resurrection, and the ascension were carefully planned out by God to line up with the Old Testament prophecies and scriptures. These parallels were noticed by the gospel writers who made sure to include them in their narratives. God was behind that too. So the gospel has nothing to do with Pagan mythology and everything to do with the plan and the promises of God. Now, skeptics, they just missed the point. The skeptics accused the gospel of drawing on pre-Christian pagan myths. Yes, they missed the point. The gospel draws on pre-Christian writings, but they're the writings of God, of God's people, not idol-worshiping pagans. And the story of Jesus Christ is, it's not some human convention. It's a true story of an account of a real man who lived, died, and rose again, as reported by eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses. The one responsible for all the parallels between the Old Testament and the life of Jesus is not some sneaky human author. It's God himself. God himself. God gave his people those promises and predictions so that when the Messiah came, that they'd be able to recognize him. Then, when Jesus did come, God's people did recognize him. Now, yes, it's true that many Jewish people did not believe in Jesus, but all the first Christians were Jewish, and they looked to their scriptures to determine that Jesus was the one they had been waiting for. You can read this in Luke 24:27 and over in Acts 17. Yes, the gospel story. The gospel story, the story of Jesus Christ, was created by God himself. Now, as this podcast begins to wind down, let me just say this to our listeners. There is not a shred of evidence that any ancient god of mythology ever existed, let alone died and came back to life. But the Bible and history tells us that this is exactly what happened with Jesus Christ. In a New York Times article, writer Peter Steinfeld cites the startling events that occurred 3 days after Jesus' death. He writes, shortly after Jesus was executed, his followers were suddenly galvanized from a baffled and cowering group of people whose message was about a living Jesus and a coming kingdom. And they began to preach at the risk of their lives, and eventually changed an empire, an entire empire. Something happened. Something happened. Exactly what? Theologian R.C. Sproul puts it this way: the claim of the resurrection is vital to Christianity. If Christ has been raised from the dead by God, then he has the credentials and certification that no other religious leader possesses. Leaders of all other religions around the globe are dead, but Christ is alive. Thank you for listening to this podcast today, and I hope that you will allow us to be a part of your life in the future. May God bless you.